Yeah, I worked at really far out the stop. So I live around there. So we recording now? Sure. Yeah.
How'd you hear about us?
I was working in the law school. I'm going to Eastern Arizona and some friends out there. So dinners.
Go ahead. Yeah, we were gonna get to it, and then we were like, it's about the Muslim population, so we probably should.
What's this mysterious cold?
Oh, that's Parmesan. Yeah, I probably. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not that familiar with it myself, Where's the pizza?
Wanna try it? 'Cause I was looking for it. We can just. You wanna turn it on? We're ready to begin. So, welcome to In the Camps. This is really a brief lecture about what's happening in Xinjiang, China. And really what's been going on there is, as we've all heard, about 1 million Muslims have been placed in internment camps. And there are differing reasons as to why this has been happening. Chinese officials say one thing, but Western officials say another. So tonight we're joined by Dr. Darren Byler, author of In the Camps, really the authoritative text on the subject, to really get a fuller picture of what's going on in Xinjiang, China. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Darren Byler.
Everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, great to be here with you. I'm going to share my screen and walk through a few pictures. Talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll be happy to take any questions about. So a lot of my work focuses on surveillance and colonialism, thinking about the two together, and is the subject of books that I've written on this topic. The first book that I wrote was really one that was focused on my dissertation. I was trained as an anthropologist. And so I started going to the Uyghur region in northwest China almost 20 years ago, but really did a lot of my research since 2010. I spent 25 months living in northwest China. First I learned Chinese before I went, and then I learned Uyghur while I was there, and also through my courses at the University of Washington. So I've lived and worked in this region for a long time, and my dissertation focused on the way that migrants, Uyghur migrants and Han migrants who came to the city found a different sort of life that was differentiated by the presence of the police and by surveillance. And my book, Terror Capitalism, looks at the way that the idea of the terrorist as it's associated with an entire population of people as potentially criminals, how it builds a new sequence in racialization that's reading their bodies, their
faces and the cultural sort of knowledge that they carry, the practices, their religious practices, how all those things are racialized in the sense that they proceed before the individual. So the individual no longer seems to matter, and instead they're categorized as dangerous by the fact of their existence. And in order to assess and control this population, the state and corporations built a whole entire security industrial complex, a sort of surveillance capitalism that targeted these groups of people. And so I wrote this book, Terror Capitalism, thinking about that and also thinking about how Uyghurs lived despite these processes, at least up until they were interned. And so the ways that they do that is by combating forms of enclosure, devaluation, and dispossession, which is the processes of terror capitalism. And they do that by building forms of palliative care and agency through storytelling, telling their story to each other and to people like me, and through friendship with each other in ways of sort of sustaining life in the midst of really horrific trauma. And how some Han people, which is the majority group from the rest of China and that are now the settler population in northwest China, how in some cases they defend Uyghurs or support them through a kind of grassroots politics of resistance. So as I was doing the research for this book, which is in ethnography, I was also translating a novel called The Backstreets with a friend. And this novel tells a lot of the same stories that I was hearing from the migrants, because it's about migrant life in the city. And so it became a key text for me to understand what migrants were going through. And this book just came out. It was published last year. So you can also read this story if you want to hear it more directly from Uyghurs about these processes. But most of my talk today is going to focus on the second book I wrote, which is called In the Camps. And it's focused on life after internment, so after 2018, when so many people had been detained, hundreds of thousands of them. I went to Kazakhstan and interviewed former detainees who were coming across the border. There's several hundred former detainees in Kazakhstan. And so I spoke to around 15 of these detainees, with a lot of depth. So, the initial interviews were several hours long, but then I followed up over and over again with them to try to get a fuller picture of what they went through and what they were continuing to live with. I also interviewed lots of the relatives of former detainees, around 50 family members, also in Kazakhstan. Many of them who had fled across the border in sometimes just as recently as a few months before I met them. And so they could talk in a lot of detail about things that they had observed outside of the camp system. And since I'd been in the region in 2018, I could also talk to them about things I myself had witnessed when I was there after so many people had been taken. During my 2018 visit to Xinjiang, I also interviewed a number of camp workers, surveillance workers. These are Han people primarily, low-level police, people that could tell me more about how the system works and what its goals are, and the forms of coercion that they feel themselves that's placed on them from people higher in command. I've also been working with lots of investigative journalists and other researchers who have gained access to hundreds of thousands of internal police files. These are files that were pulled together by a state contractor who had worked with the police force in Urumqi to build a mobile policing app. And so we have all this granular detail of police reports from every week, every day, every checkpoint in Urumqi over this period of time in at least some of the areas of the city. And so it tells us the capacities of the system and again, what some of its goals are. Also looked at lots of open source and internal government industry documents that speak to this. The story of In the Camps is really, has sort of a shallow history. It's just really looking from 2017 to the present, although I talk a little bit about the history in the book. And it's more of a non-fiction narrative essay. It's written for a more general audience, so it's less sort of academic than the first book. Along with this book, several of the chapters of it are also featured in another book that I co-edited called Xinjiang Year Zero, which has more of a historical vantage point to all of this, and it has around 20 chapters or so from different scholars who are looking at different parts of this system. This book is free. You can download it from the website at the Australian National University Press. So if you're looking for more sources, this is a place to turn. All right, so the story of what I'm looking at in Northwest China really starts in the 1990s when China is opening up to the world and becoming a manufacturer of the world's products. So, this is when we start to see made in China things appear on our shelves here in North America. To drive that economy, the factories, the industries that are focused on export in the eastern part of the country need a lot of raw materials. And so they develop a campaign, not the companies, but the state develops a campaign called Open Up the Northwest and then Open Up the West, which was about gaining access to those natural resources, about getting access to oil and natural gas and coal. Xinjiang is this immense space. It's the size of all of Southwest United States combined, from New Mexico to California. And so it has 20% of Chinese oil and natural gas, even larger portion of Chinese coal. And as that infrastructure was built, the pipelines and roads and all of that, to gain access to those resources, the settler population, which is Han people from other parts of the country, also began to develop industrial agriculture in the southern part of the region. This region here is the ancestral homeland of the Uyghurs. Around 12 million people live here. And prior to this, there really had not been much of a Han presence in this place. So it produced a lot of changes very quickly. The first change, or one of the first changes, was the cost of living began to rise for Uyghurs because there was all of this new investment in people coming from other parts of the country. Basic staples like bread or flour and rice was suddenly much more expensive. But Uyghurs were mostly excluded from the resource sector, from the oil and natural gas companies, even from a lot of the construction contracts. Some of them were pushed off of their farms into sort of sharecropper positions as tenant farmers in the bigger industrial cotton production. So around 85% of Chinese cotton comes from this region. It is the main product now that's being produced, but Uyghurs are not really benefiting to a significant degree from these resources. So that's the underlying tension. This is why Uyghurs protest, land seizures and police brutality, and this is what leads eventually to the camp system. Now in my work, I was mostly interested in how migrants coming from those rural places were finding life in the city, and how they were using new kinds of infrastructure like technology, digital technology, to make sense of their lives. So when I started my work in 2011, 3G networks had just arrived. Everyone was buying a smartphone for the first time. And they were finding ways to network with people in the city, and they were moving to the city. So hundreds of thousands of young migrants were coming. They said they came to find jobs, and they did, but they also came to find greater religious freedom, because in the countryside, where a lot of the tensions were happening around the settler movements, there was a lot more policing. So everyone knew if you were going to the mosque, if you were practicing Islam or not in the countryside, but in the city there was more anonymity, and so people said that they felt free to go to the mosque. This is a picture from 2014, when you see that there's more people for Friday prayers outside of the mosque than inside, because they simply can't fit inside. And this is actually quite a large space inside there. At the same time, they knew that these mosques were surveilled. You can see the cameras here. And they knew that the imams in these mosques were trained by the state and that their teachings were censored by the state. And so they thought of this space as a space that was semi-free for them to practice the rituals of Islam, but they weren't really receiving what they thought of as the real teachings of Islam. They said real Islam was happening on their smartphone. So everyone was using, most people were using their smartphone to share messages, to be part of WeChat groups with their friends back in their villages, but also to study the Quran, to learn about things that were happening outside of the country in places like Turkey and Egypt. This was the time of the Arab Spring, so they were interested in those things. Mostly they were just curious about what it meant to be a Muslim today. Mostly very normal Muslim stuff. But the state saw this space as a sort of unregulated space and a space where Uyghurs were being radicalized. They saw this sort of activity, these many people going to the mosque, as a sign of Uyghurs becoming extremists, that they were becoming terrorists. And there were incidents that were moving towards the kind of terrorism that meet international standards of terrorism, like an incident that happened in Kunming in March of 2014, 301, which was referred to as China's 9/11. This incident involved around a dozen young Uyghurs who attacked Han civilians with knives and killed over 30 people. There were other incidents of improvised devices in cars, other attacks of Han civilians around this period of time as well. And it did appear as though they were appealing to things like the Islamic State in some of the ways that they taught that the people that carried out this violence framed what they were doing. And so the state declared the People's War on Terror in May of 2014, which is right as I was starting my fieldwork, the second year of my fieldwork. And so I saw them put up these posters in every neighborhood, including my own, that said it's now illegal for Uyghurs to dress in Muslim ways, for women to veil themselves like this, or for men to have beards, or any sort of Islamic symbol on their clothing. And they also said further that if you catch anyone who's doing this, you can and report it, you can get a reward. And so really what's happening is a sort of criminalization of Islamic behavior. What they're saying is that if you look this way, which is actually quite a traditional way for Uyghurs to dress in southern Xinjiang, that you are a criminal, that you are potentially a terrorist. The People's War on Terror, took some time to really unfold. Initially, it was about criminalizing apparent behavior, or bodily behavior outside in public space. But it also initiated a whole series of research projects that would assess the population. And so this was a project that brought together state security and private industry to build tools to break the autonomy of the Uyghur internet, and then over time begin to enclose the Uyghur population. They hired around 60,000 assistant police, many of them from the Uyghur population itself, and then another 30,000 or so regular police. And so it was one of the most tightly policed places in the world. They also invested around $100 billion in infrastructure. Some of that is building camps themselves. But a good deal of it was surveillance infrastructure. There's 1,400 tech firms working in Northwest China. And so it really became an incubator for tech development in China. And we also saw pretty quickly that there was a kind of direct transfer from companies that built state projects like a public security system, a safe city system, to commercial applications. And this has to do with the way that when you're working for the state, you get access to all of the state's data, which is all of the ID information for every citizen and much more data as well. And so to train algorithms, data is really important, and so having access to data and also the investment from the state to build the systems to begin with allows companies to really accelerate their growth. And so you see a few examples of them here. A company called iFlyTech that was until recently partnered with MIT built tools to automate the transcription, translation, and assessment of Uyghur speech. So Uyghurs before were using the voice memo function of WeChat, and so the surveillance system couldn't track what they were saying. But if you can automate the transcription, translation, and assessment of speech, then you can assess what people are saying across language. Now, iFlyTech is one of the leading voice recognition companies in the world. Until very recently, you could buy their products on Amazon. I haven't checked to see if you still can. There's also tools that were developed to automate the assessment of Uyghur faces. One of the first state-sponsored projects to automate racialization. It's looking at the phenotypes of the person's face, the shape of their eyes and nose and so on, to detect their ethnicity and to alert police to the presence of a Uyghur or a Muslim. And many of these companies have developed these kinds of tools. So those tools are helpful to the system, but there's still a lot of human labor that needs to go into building the base data set. And so there was these forms that were distributed throughout the Civil Affairs Ministry, grassroots level units called xiachu in Chinese, which asked the state workers to surveil each family, each person, and assess them using these 10 categories of trustworthiness. So each person starts out with 100 points, and for each category that applies to them, they're deducted 10 points. And so some of these categories are very basic, like what is the person's age, what's their ethnicity, are they Uyghur, are they unemployed? Many Uyghurs, perhaps half the population, this applies to. I mean, for all Uyghurs, the ethnic category applies to them. Then there was questions about travel history, which is 4, 7, 8, and 9. Did they have a passport? Have they visited one of 26 banned countries, which are Muslim majority countries like Turkey or Kazakhstan? And have they overstayed a visa? Those sorts of questions. Number 5, 6, and 10 were really important questions about religious practice. And these are the ones that caught most of the migrants I've been interviewing. Did you pray daily? Do you possess unauthorized religious knowledge? Have you taught your children about Islam or about Uyghur identity, Uyghur history in your home? So in this form, only 2 people are registered as normal. The rest are registered as trustworthy. But in many cases, people were registered as wufangxian, which means untrustworthy in Chinese. And the untrustworthy people were the ones that were sent to the camps. But still, again, this wasn't enough to really fully assess the population, because people knew what the right answers were to these questions, and they couldn't prove, in some cases at least, if this person had religious knowledge or not. So there had to be more sophisticated assessment. And a lot of that came through this grid policing system that was built out across the region, using surveillance hubs every several hundred meters. These are called convenient for the people's police stations. One of the people I interviewed for the book worked in one of these stations, and he talked about how they were given these tools, which are kind of called counterterrorism swords, that can be plugged into someone's phone and look through their digital history. And these are digital forensics tools that mirror and mimic the capacities of tools that were developed by an Israeli company called Cellebrite to assess Palestinians. here it was used mostly by a company called Mia Pico, and was used to assess Uyghurs and Kazakhs. The low-level police officer who I write about in the book said that usually if they scanned someone's phone and they got a red signal, or red code, which meant that this person is untrustworthy, it was because they had listened to unauthorized religious teachings, had been a member of a religious study group on WeChat, had used a VPN or WhatsApp. So you can see that the technology assessment, the data valence of these tools was really an important sort of aspect in how they decided who should be sent to these camps. That they found by tracking what they had done on their phones, that these people were guilty of a kind of thought crime or pre-crime. Many people were then sent to these camps. This is the largest one. It's just south of Urumqi. It's in Dabancheng, where they were held in sort of medium security prisons, and really treated as prisoners, even though they had really done nothing wrong. In mid-2018, we started to see imagery. This is from a leaked video of drone footage from the government of detainees being transferred from facility to facility. And the development ministry of the region said that the camps are now becoming a carrier of the economy because they're attracting so many companies from eastern China to relocate. And so a lot of the work that began to happen in these places involved textile manufacturing. People that were transferred from the camp enclosure to the nearby facilities, or sometimes the factories were inside the camps themselves. One of the people who I write about in the book who was detained and then sent to one of these factories was this woman, Gulzira Alpan, who's an ethnic Kazakh woman from northern Xinjiang who had been living in Kazakhstan and came back to care for her mother and then was detained upon her arrival. She lived in a cell in one of the camps for almost a year. She talked about it as being very horrific. There was a flat screen TV up on the wall that they were forced to watch many hours a day. They were forced to sit on stools for many hours a day. They weren't allowed to cover their faces with their hands because then the cameras didn't have the capacity to recognize their face. If they spent too long on the toilet, they would be beaten. It was a really traumatic and just brutal experience for her. And so she was released for about 2 days back to her village, and then the local officials said, now you're going to be sent to this factory, which in this industrial park that was about 7 kilometers from the camp where she was held before. And when she arrived at the camp, she recognized her boss, who's this man, Wang Xinhua, who she recognized him because he had come to the camp and had selected her to be one of the workers in his factory. Here he's speaking to state media about how successful the factory is. And he's saying that it's a job creation program that has generated around 2,000 jobs for Uyghurs and Kazakhs. It's also generated $6 million in sales in 2018. What he doesn't say is that he was paying the workers like Gulzira only 300 yuan, which is a sixth of the minimum wage, and then a piece rate of a penny and a half per pair of gloves that they made. Gulzira told me, you can see it was a kind of slave labor. And in not all circumstances of these workers is the same, but in every case, the conditions that they're working on is unfree. Gulzira told me that there were checkpoints at the entrance of the walled-off dormitory and factory where her ID and face were scanned. She said we would have our bodies and phones checked when we arrived and in the middle of the day. When we were leaving for the dormitory at the end of the day, they would check again because they were worried we might take a sewing needle. After we got to know the police contractors, we asked them, why are you still here watching us? They just laughed and never replied. The answer to this question was that the security workers were monitoring whether or not they were acting like submissive, re-educated industrial workers. Another former re-educated worker named Rebecca told me, we just had to smile and say yes, yes. We were like pets. So there's the system of unfreedom of forced labor means that the workers can't quit their jobs. They'll be sent back to the camp or to prison. They can't protest the working conditions or their pay. They have to pretend that they are enjoying or learning, that they are appreciating the opportunity to work under these conditions. So the system of surveillance throughout all of this is extreme. It's really a limit case in terms of how automated forms of surveillance are being used in the world. In the camp system, as people are being interrogated, it's being decided if they should be sent to prison or to the camp or to the factory. In some cases, they use these sort of automated lie detector tests, which is measuring the facial expressions, the pores on the person's face, see if they dilate or not, to assess their criminality. And there's a lot of reason to believe that these tools are not accurate, but in this context, it doesn't really matter if they're accurate or not, because if they are said to be accurate and believed to be accurate, they have devastating effects on the people that are being assessed. Some of the ways in which the surveillance and infrastructure is used coercively has to do with the geography. Now, this is the higher detention facility here, where people were held before, and then these are the shoe factories right behind the facility. And so you can see they're directly adjacent to each other. Throughout all of Xinjiang, these checkpoints are at many jurisdictional boundaries. I went through many of them when I was there in 2018, where you have your face scanned and you have the picture on your ID scanned as well, and then it's matched to your face. It's very similar to a border check that you might have gone through in the US. But this is happening 10 times a day or more for people as they move through space, which means that the state understands where people are at all times, that they are searchable in real time, and that they can be assessed using automated systems to look for patterns in movement. Is this person deviating from their usual path, and so on. A lot of my work more recently has focused on the way that the database itself was built, looking at the internal police documents. These are as a map of the checkpoints that were done in Urumqi and in checkpoint reports that were made in Urumqi in 2017 to 2019. What we see in these reports is a depiction of Uyghurs and other Muslims as enemies. Enemy intelligence is the goal of the system. Gathering this intelligence, it builds on the sort of Maoist discourse of the counter-revolutionary person as an enemy. But in this case, it's pointing towards Muslims who are seen as potentially disloyal or untrustworthy. So what in fact doing is it's criminalizing Uyghur behavior, and it's building on a kind of settler fragility, a feeling of fear of the Muslim other that many people in the region have. And this sort of common sense understanding of what is extremist, what is terrorist, what is dangerous, becomes the base of the data set, because whenever someone reports someone as being Muslim or too Muslim, then it is associated with that person's ID, and it follows them, and so it becomes a negative credential. So for instance, in some of the police reports, we see things like, this store does not have non-halal products, it must be extremist. Or in this case, like, Uyghurs spoke Uyghur in front of me instead of Chinese, they must be extremists. It's like, just like sort of crazy assumptions that are become the norm, become the common sense of the system. And as it moves into the system, it becomes a kind of black box. You don't see where those reports came from anymore, you just know that this person has been categorized this way in the past. And so it produces a kind of feedback loop of predictive policing, that this person has been predicted to be a criminal, and so therefore they must be a criminal, and that means that we should target them with more and more policing and find, and so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's also the first instance where this sort of system is built out at scale, where it's targeting an entire population of people. So this is an image from one of the police databases where you see a Uyghur person being assessed at a checkpoint, and an orange tag, which means he's potentially suspicious, is coming up in the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. The system is also flexible, so it's not meant to inconvenience the settlers. This is what one of the Han friend of mine told me after she went to visit her family in the region in 2018. This isn't her real name. Lu Yan's relatives also complained about the checkpoints. For instance, at first when the campaign began, everyone who was riding a public bus to the city had to wait while the Uyghurs were checked. After several months though, it got better because the buses just started leaving the Uyghurs behind at the checkpoint while the bus continued on to the city. What Lu Yan's relatives are describing here about it got better is that they became less inconvenienced by the system. There's green lanes that are at most of these checkpoints where Han people are just simply waved through while the Uyghurs are being checked. And so the Uyghurs are included in the system, but in a very subordinated way. They are, and so it means that they're not excluded, they're not ghettoized by the system, or expelled by the system. They are included by the system, but always in this subordinated way and through automated systems that make it really difficult to resist. The system is also indexing, every time you go through a checkpoint, you feel your privilege as a Han person because you know that you're not being, that this system is here to protect you and you're not being inconvenienced by it. So it's like the TSA pre-check at the airport. You have the wealth and the knowledge to move through the system while these other people don't. It's also not like the TSA pre-check because this is an Islamophobic system that is part of a colonial operation. Now, there is some ways in which this technology is traveling to other parts of the country, it's being adapted to other kinds of conditions, and as that's happening, you also see Han people in China becoming more aware of it. And the most obvious instance of this was in November of 2022, when there was a fire in Urumqi, where a number of Uyghur people were killed, and they posted videos of people burning to death from across the apartment complex. None of the people could get out, or many of the people couldn't get out because there was quarantine restrictions for COVID as part of the zero COVID policy that was in operation across China at the time. And so many Han people in the city began to protest. They went to the city square and they said, we need to be protected and the zero COVID policy. And so then those protests spread across the entire country. And in Shanghai, there was a really important protest that centered around a street in Shanghai called Urumqi Road, connecting the fire in Urumqi to what happened to the protests that people were engaging with in Shanghai. But as this is happening, there's also a forgetting about this older system of enclosure that Uyghurs have suffered under, and that Uyghurs were the ones that died in the fire. Instead, it just became a protest about Han citizens demanding their civil rights. And so there's a kind of eraser that's happening. At the same time, there's a recognition that the state is using technology in really arbitrary ways, and many people are now very upset about it in China, and definitely in the diaspora as well. So what does this case suggest? I'm really going to wrap up here. Enclosure is part of a process of original accumulation of capital, of bringing things into the market. So we see that in relation to oil and natural gas and cotton in Xinjiang, but eventually now we see it in relation to labor, that they're bringing Uyghurs to work in the factory, and they're forcing them to do it. Well, this is also the history of American slavery, of bringing, African workers, slaves, to the United States to work under unfree conditions. That's also part of capitalism. It's a different moment, but I'm trying to show that it's linked. Surveillance or overseeing is essential to these processes, and we see this happening in many conditions, many situations in South Africa and the US, in Israel and Palestine. It also, though, travels beyond sort of colonial or frontier situations of capitalism to domestic situations. And so we see it now becoming a tool of authoritarian statecraft in China. We see it also in the way that police across North America are using forms of surveillance to assess populations as well. So settler colonialism, which is kind of the center of what I'm trying to talk about, is about possession of the land of the colonized, and also possession of their way of life, elimination of that way of life, and a replacement of it. And so it's a violent process of assimilation that uses domination of the institutions of the colonized to attack those people. In a settler colonial system, you also have to have an occupation, and we see that happening in Northwest China. The fourth element in what my work is contributing to is to point out that in contemporary colonial systems, there's also digital enclosure, which produces material and epistemic violence, which is attacking the knowledge system of the colonized in ways that are automated and scalable, that that move beyond the ability of the colonizer and start to work for the colonizer. And so it turns the colonized into objects, really, of a kind of sequence of operations, and really strives to eliminate all forms of agency that they have. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Hopefully that wasn't too fast. Really happy to take any questions you might have. Thanks again for your attention.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Byler, and we'll take questions from the audience. Feel free to you can just shout them out loud. No need to raise your hand or anything.
I have a question. Are you able to hear me from here?
I can sort of hear you, yeah. Just you speak up.
I'll come closer to the microphone. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So my name's Brock. I'm a senior here at WashU, studying marketing in Chinese. But anyway, so one, thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. Loved getting to hear everything that you had to share. My question is, a lot of the time when I hear about what's going on in this region in the news, a lot of the time it's about someone maybe saying they don't believe what's happening or they deny that this is the case. And at least my understanding based on the material you presented is that this is factually happening. So my question is, are people just saying this because they're scared of backlash from the PRC government, or are there people who actually believe that this isn't happening?
But that's a good question. So I think it really depends on the sort of social position of the person speaking in terms of how much knowledge they have, and how much they're willing to question the knowledge that they've been given. So Han people that live in the region itself, which is around 10 million or so people, Han people, they have a pretty clear understanding of what's happening in the camp system. People that are sent to Xinjiang from other parts of the country also understand that, but that's a pretty small proportion of the population as a whole. There are some people in China who are engaged in sort of international media to a larger degree, and they probably have a fairly decent understanding of what's happening too, if they believe what they read anyway. And so, that's another segment of the population. But the vast majority of people in China see Xinjiang as simultaneously far away, like not close to them, and also just as another province in China, and the Uyghurs as a threat to national security that the state is dealing with. And so they feel like if the state says that these people are criminals, then they must be criminals, and they're kind of willing to accept it at that. It's not that different from the way that a lot of Americans saw the U.S. presence in Iraq and Afghanistan as necessary, or as just not that relevant to their lives. But of course, people that actually went to Afghanistan or Iraq, they feel quite different. So it's distance in those ways. Then on top of all of that, the Chinese state is a really sophisticated media apparatus that provides a certain narrative to people that allows them to sort of dismiss what they might otherwise think more critically about. All that said, though, there is a real shift that's happening among, especially the younger generation, people that are really upset with the way that the state handled the COVID restrictions. And so I'm meeting many more Chinese students coming abroad for the first time who really want to engage on this topic in particular, but are also just in general very critical of the government. And so if they're in that position, I think that they're much more willing to understand that this is very likely happening, and they've seen the capacity of the state in their own lives now, and so I think that is waking them up to the truth of all of this. But sure, there's many people that doubt this. A lot of people would view this as something that's simply generated by the Western media, which is imperialist and anti-China. But as they're doing that, they're discounting Chinese state documents that say exactly the opposite, and also the voices of Uyghur citizens who are their own compatriots. They're also Chinese citizens. Yeah, there's work to be done to sort of mitigate the ways in which this is understood by people in China.
Great, thank you for that answer.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you for your talk, Professor Byler. And I really enjoyed reading your book, In the Camps, and I've also I'm familiar with the work of Sean Roberts. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like both of you argue that this situation in Xinjiang is really a continuation of the global war on terror. And Sean Roberts goes into specific detail, right, how the U.S. put the Uyghurs on the UN terrorist watch list in exchange for tacit approval for the invasion of Iraq. And in many ways, which sort of allows for the legal persecution of the Uyghurs, and in many ways the domestic propaganda and international justification for these camps seems to mirror the type of rhetoric you see in the post 9/11 Bush era, right? And as you mentioned, right, they refer to the Kunming attack as the Chinese 9/11. And I even saw a documentary on CCTV that in many ways mirrors the type of anti-Muslim propaganda in sort of the Bush era. So my question is, like, do you see what's happening in China as an extension of the war on terror initiated by the U.S.? And if so, what is the responsibility of Western intellectuals and journalists? Like, should they point this out? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they should point this out, and that's what I'm trying to do. And sure, it is a continuation of the global war on terror. The way that you read about it in the Chinese military and policing theory literature is that it's done with Chinese characteristics. But they're using the same technologies and tactics of counterterrorism, like countering violent extremism, which is about sort of domestic policing and predictive policing, and also counterinsurgency theory, which is about mapping the entire population and breaking up the social network and all of that. They're looking at companies like Palantir as inspirations for the kinds of tools that they want to build. So there's those kinds of direct connections. There are also some differences in the sense that this is building on a Maoist legacy of thought reform, of targeting people who are seen as enemies of the people with that. And also the Belt and Road Initiative has put China in contact with Muslim populations in ways that it hadn't before, and that has fed the Islamophobia that is in China in ways that is a bit different from the US. So for instance, like when they talk about what they want to do in Xinjiang, they talk about it as an they want to prevent Xinjiang from becoming another Libya. And what they meant by another Libya is the way that Chinese migrant workers in Libya were evacuated from Libya, 30,000 of them, in one of China's first overseas military operations. And so there's this huge story in China about the violence that Chinese migrant workers witnessed in Libya. And so that's their experience with Islam, that's their experience with, they would think, terrorism, and they conflate, all Muslims as being the same, and think that, Uyghurs are going to enact another Libya, and so we need to prevent it. That's something different, I think, than the way that U.S. counterterrorism talks about it. But there's so many similarities that I think we can't. There's no way to deny that the discourse of terrorism, which is, should be understood as a colonial discourse that is about labeling people that resist as a kind of savage or barbarian, and undermining any kinds of claims they have to resist. Of course, we can recognize that crime is crime, and that killing civilians is something that should be, that's abhorrent and should be opposed. But attaching this label to an entire population of people as a sort of, part of their essence, that's a racial move, and is something that we should also oppose.
I've got a couple quick questions. So, I think that we can all agree on the fact that, it is the case that 1 million people, at least, have or are being incarcerated in these camps. But can you speak more on what's actually happening inside these facilities? And also, there was a protest here a couple months back. It was well attended, but it wasn't really a type of thing where it was loud and all. It was more of a silent type of protest on this issue, and many Chinese students were there, but I think that there's still hesitancy within the Chinese community, at least on campus, to publicly oppose what's happening. I think that it's clear that the incarceration is extrajudicial and even has an element of racism to it. So with those things said, how could we make it so that Chinese students are more comfortable speaking about or learning about this issue in public? Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's a really complex thing. In China as an authoritarian state, people that have grown up in that system understand that there's a real cost in speaking up on issues. And if you can avoid speaking up, people will, because they don't want their future to be compromised in terms of what kind of jobs they have, whether they can travel back to China or not, whether they're going to be cut off from their family forever, whether they'll be imprisoned, if they, at a certain point, and so those costs are real. And then there's also a lot of incentives to not only not speak up, but to join and to support this effort, even though you maybe understand it to be untrue or bad or wrong. Supporting it means that it will open doors for you within the government apparatus and the industry. So those are dynamics that are in play that unless you're coming from this place, you might not fully understand or appreciate. At the same time, I think people are beginning to make those kinds of judgments, those sorts of calls about it. And some of it, it might start with them just wanting to know more information, them experiencing and witnessing firsthand other people protesting. For many people, the protests in November were their first protests ever, the first time they'd ever been on the street. And so it's a new thing, and so it will take some time, and it will take effort too to sustain it. And so that's part of the work that has to be done. I think another thing that's important in talking about this is to talk about the history of camp systems and how this isn't, it's not unique to China. These things have happened in many places. And to do some of the work we were just talking about of showing how this is linked to other discourses, other technologies, of counterterrorism and so on. So to make it clear that this isn't irrational, this isn't simply because China is bad or Chinese people are bad. It's not about promoting an anti-Chinese racism, which is another issue in the world. And so another part of the story is to really help convey what's going on in the camps. To get to your other question, these are indoctrination camps to a certain degree, but they're also just spaces where people are being broken by really extreme forms of violence, psychological violence. And people are forced to write thought reports every week. Chinese are called 思想汇报, which is them confessing their crime over and over again. And they're also, when they're being interrogated, asked to name other people. They go through the contacts on their phone and point out which other people should be detained. And they're doing this under torture in many cases, in chairs where they're strapped down, where they're being beaten. Everyone in the camps has witnessed violence, in terms of physical beatings, and they themselves have been placed under really extreme forms of control, which means that they have to sit on these stools for many hours at a time and then recite Chinese or sing Chinese songs. Everyone I interviewed who came out of the camps is someone who's dealing with post-traumatic stress, that his life is forever altered by that experience. And so, in some ways it's worse than prison because it's about targeting the individual and forcing that individual to deny many aspects of who they are. And that's not even talking about, the sexual violence that women experience in these camps, at least at times, and the forms of forced birth control that women are subjugated to. It's not talking about the way that parents are separated from their children. Children become wards of the state in the boarding school system. There's just such immense trauma that it's really hard to even talk about. At the same time, it's not mass death. It's in the sense of physical death for the most part. People aren't being killed in the same way that other genocides have happened. This is a slower genocidal process of like slowly killing the individual that was there and replacing it with something else. And that mirrors other colonial processes where they talked about killing the savage but saving the man or the Christian. And so there again, I'm trying to make another parallel case to make it clear to a Chinese person that what's happening in China is a repetition of things that have happened elsewhere.
Thanks, Dr. Weiler, for doing this work and sharing it with us. My name is Jimmy. I have a question about how the creation of this technology will have, or does have, like ripple effects in two contexts. So the first would be like in like the west, or in the eastern part of Central Asia, in the bordering states, particularly like in eastern Uzbekistan, in the Fergana Valley, where you have Turkic Muslims who are kind of experiencing for the first time the ability to have some religious expression as the government becomes a little bit freer there. How will sort of those Central Asian governments maybe co-opt this technology or work with the Chinese government to implement similar things? So that's the first context. And then also sort of as a part of like Chinese like technological colonialism as they're building into Africa and the rest of Southeast Asia, what are the most dangerous of kind of the ways in which the ability to surveil through these things is being set up, I guess?
Those are good questions. So from this perspective of the technologists in China, the people building these systems, the Belt and Road Initiative is seen as something that has unlimited market potential. Like one of the spokespeople for one of the companies said that 60% of the world's Muslim populations live on the Belt and Road, and so they see this as a growth industry for the tools they're building. And he's saying basically that if there's Muslims, that they need to have this kind of technology applied to them. That said, it's not that easy to replicate a Chinese style system elsewhere. There needs to be a lot of state capital investment, and there needs to be a lot of human labor. So, the system in Xinjiang wouldn't have worked if there wasn't around 100,000 state workers, manning the checkpoints and scanning people and so on. And then in addition, hundreds of thousands more people going into people's homes and building the base data set, profiling each person and so on. And so you need a big bureaucratic workforce to implement the system, and a lot of other states don't have that capacity. And so most of what we've seen so far in terms of how this moves is it moves in the form of safe city systems. There's around 100 countries in the world that are using Chinese tech that are built by the companies that are working in Xinjiang. But the kinds of capacity that a country like Ecuador has, which has built something like this, is about the same as like one district of Urumqi in terms of its scale and density. And this is for the entire country of Ecuador. So it's just not nearly as dense, and it's being used in a much more targeted way elsewhere to target, political rivals or, particular dissidents, those sorts of things. When we see it being built at scale and with density, like we see it in China, that's when I think it becomes more alarming, because then it could be, pointed towards entire populations of people. So far, we haven't seen that. I haven't seen that elsewhere. The most troubling places are places like Cambodia, where the Public Security Bureau of China is working directly with state security in Cambodia to build like a central control over internet data, so that they can assess data from all internet users in the country. Again, I don't know that they'll have the capacity to do all of the sorts of things that they do in China, but that kind of centralization of power over populations is the most troubling thing. And so, there's a lot that needs to be done to think about the implications of all of that. We have tools that are really similar to the ones the Chinese are using here in North America. We're mostly just using them at the borders, like at our airports and so on. They're not at scale, in the way that they're distributed. But if you're an undocumented person in the U.S., like those same surveillance systems do actually really affect your life, and so we can also think about implications here at home in terms of how people are affected by them. I don't know enough about the specifics of Uzbekistan to know what the government has in mind. But yeah, everyone should be concerned that a state can use your digital history against you, especially if you're someone who's from a vulnerable population.
Let's give Dr. Fowler a hand. Thank you so much, Dr. Ballard. We look forward to welcoming you in person one day, and we really appreciate hearing your wisdom tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. It's great to see you all.
Of course. All right, take care.
Bye.
All right, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Oh, by the way, free pizza. Free pizza.